So I guess for most Danes coming to New Zealand, they would have come from Denmark, but that really wasn't the case for me because my family left Denmark in 1949 and they went to live in Southwest Africa, in Windhoek. And so that was my boyhood, if you like, started in Africa with the culture of Windhoek. And Windhoek was a town at the time with three different cultures amongst the Europeans. And then as well as that, of course, there was the divide between the Africans and the Europeans. So we had been brought up in that culture. And so for me, the cultural difference was more from Africa to New Zealand than it was from Denmark to New Zealand, because at home we'd always been Danish, whether we had Afrikaans or English or German friends. And we spoke Danish at home. And at school, I went to an English school, so I had spoken English at school. So I didn't have that was just part of me. And when I arrived in New Zealand, of course, I took all that with me. So I arrived not with differences of Denmark and New Zealand, but with the differences between Africa and the culture of the 50s and coming to New Zealand and having to integrate those two things. So no, I was myself. I was happy to be myself, and other kids, I just had to fit in. So I had to learn to be a New Zealander in the sense of accepting others and learning to fit in. So the big thing I discovered quite soon was I wasn't bad at sport, particularly swimming, and so that was the way I started to fit in. And also I loved all sports. So I learned to play rugby. So of course in New Zealand, if you learn to play rugby, you fit in most society, and that was really the thing that helped me. And I guess that was my boyhood, my schooling. That went on. There was some differences between African schooling and the schooling in New Zealand. So I'd had a fairly formal English type of schooling. I'd gone to a school in Africa called St. George's School in Windhoek, and that was based on the old English church system, even down to the point of learning Latin and so on. So that was that background. So when I came to New Zealand, I had some differences with that, and then having to pick up more of the social studies type of thing that we were doing at those times in New Zealand. But yeah, no, I soon fitted in. I made friends. I belonged to various clubs, and so that was all. My boyhood was all taken care of. At home, we were Danish, and that had always been the case in Africa as well. There'd been a Danish society in Windhoek, and I was used to the fact that my parents found Danish friends as they did here. And my parents very quickly joined up with the Danish society, and the Danes back in the late 50s, early 60s, they were very supportive of one another. And there were people who they were craftsmen, like builders and so on. And their attitude was that this was a new country for them, a new start, and that they could do anything. But that we, the children, were if we could, were helping. So for my father, he started a business, but he also built his own house. And so I would turn up at the site on my way after school. I'd cycle across and make a batch of cement for him. He'd come after I'd done that, and he'd start laying blocks, and I'd go off to do my training. So that was quite a sort of a thing we did. And then eventually we got the house built, and so that was my part of helping that part. So of course from boyhood we grow up. I did as well, I think. Well, I'm not sure if I've grown up yet, but you never know. So yes, I was 13 when we arrived. And then in time, I got to university, and I got a degree, and I got married. I married a New Zealand girl, Guinea, my wife. But Guinea really took to the Danish culture very well, especially when we moved. Something's just crawling on my eyelashes here, just a moment. So when we moved to... we got married, and after we got married, we'd been in New Zealand maybe 3 years working. I then had the opportunity to go to Denmark, which we did. And what not many people realize, well, I was in the fishing industry at the time, and in New Zealand, we were the first country in the world to actually form an association with Japan. And so I picked up a lot of the Japanese technology. And so when I landed myself in Denmark, the Danes found out about that and were very keen for me to work in their research facility. So I worked for the Ministry of Fisheries as a research engineer. And Guinea, of course, was with me, and so we lived in Denmark, and in a very short time Guinea had picked up Danish, and we were living as Danes in Denmark. But with my New Zealand background, particularly that background which is associated to the learnings from Japan, which I was now introducing into Western culture, into Europe. And so I was leading that research for 3 years or so, and that was my role. And in that role, of course, we learned about Denmark, living in the snow and the winter, and well, actually the mist it was, because the first winter we had wasn't snow, it was just a grey fog from October through to February or whatever it was. and everybody got cabin fever, as I recall. But yes, so it was effectively a journey that I came from Denmark and through Africa to here, and then back to Denmark, taking our culture and our learnings back to Denmark. And then, of course, we've come back here. When the family came, we decided we had to make a choice. Do we stay in Denmark or do we come back to New Zealand? And we decided we'd come back to where Guinea's family was and my family were, and so we've stayed here ever since.